The Galactic Coalition had long dismissed Earth as a primitive world, its untamed landscapes an obstacle rather than an asset. Their armies, honed through centuries of urban warfare and mechanized assaults, had perfected the art of conquest in controlled environments. Metropolises reduced to rubble, orbital engagements calculated with precision, enemy resistance crushed under towering war machines. Planets teeming with dense, chaotic ecosystems were considered backwaters, relics of an age before civilization bent nature to its will. Earth, with its sprawling jungles and unpredictable climates, was nothing more than an afterthought. When the Coalition's high command devised a military exercise to demonstrate their superiority, Earth was chosen as the testing ground. A simulated war game in one of its vast, humid jungles would serve as a public spectacle, a display of their might against an outdated, organic battlefield. The Coalition's finest warriors, elite soldiers from the Hekari, the armored Sith, and the precision-driven Xenar, were deployed confident that their advanced technology and rigorous training would render the terrain irrelevant. Human participation was an afterthought. The Coalition allowed Earth to send a token force of observers, nothing more than a diplomatic courtesy. A handful of human soldiers, representing nations with historical expertise in jungle warfare, were permitted to accompany the exercise. They were small, lightly equipped, and in the eyes of the Coalition archaic. What could an organic species, one lacking energy shields, exoskeletal armor and neural targeting, possibly offer in a modern battlefield? The aliens smirked at the human contingent, clad in simple camouflage fatigues, their weapons projectile-based instead of plasma-driven. Major Juno Varela, a veteran of Earth's Special Forces, watched from the staging grounds as the Coalition's troops disembarked from their drop ships. Towering Hekari warriors lumbered past in reflective battle armor, their multi-limbed frames adapting seamlessly to the weight of their gear. The Sith moved in formation, their exocets enhancing their already formidable strength. The Xenar, humanoid in shape but eerily precise in their movements, scanned the treetops with glowing ocular implants, their rifles equipped with sensors that could map entire topographies in seconds. They were all making the same mistake. Varela exchanged a glance with Lieutenant Idris Nyong'o, a fellow Special Forces operative from Kenya. He was sharpening a machete absent-mindedly, watching the aliens with the detached amusement of a man who knew exactly how this was going to end. "They're walking into this like it's a city siege," Nyong'o murmured. "All this tech, all these formations. They think the jungle's just an obstacle." Varela smirked, adjusting the knife strapped to her vest. "They think it's dead. That it doesn't fight back." A Coalition commander, a Xenar named Commander Relther, strode toward them. His posture exuded the arrogance of a species that had never known defeat. "We begin the exercise at dawn," he announced. His voice carried the clipped efficiency of someone who had already decided the outcome. "You may accompany, but you will not interfere." Varela nodded, her expression neutral. "Wouldn't dream of it." At sunrise, the Coalition forces advanced into the jungle. They moved in disciplined columns, their steps synchronized, weapons held at the ready. Their tactical HUDs projected real-time data, overlaying the humid air with glowing indicators, temperature, humidity levels, biosignatures. Everything was accounted for, every variable calculated. Except the ones they didn't understand. The jungle swallowed them whole. The first sign of trouble came within an hour. The alien formations, so meticulously designed for urban combat, found themselves constrained. Towering trees disrupted line of sight, their interwoven canopies blocking the Coalition's aerial reconnaissance. The thick undergrowth made movement sluggish, their heavy armor catching on vines, their sensors overloaded by the sheer density of life. Then the communications began to falter. At first it was minor interference. A garbled transmission here, a slight delay there. Then entire squads fell silent. No distress calls. No gunfire. Just silence. A Sith officer, frustrated, activated his comlink. "Squad 3 report. Static. Squad 4 confirm location." Silence. The first bodies were found strung up in the trees, their weapons gone, their throats slit with eerie precision. Panic rippled through the ranks. Creatures? No, this was too calculated. Too deliberate. Something was hunting them. Commander Relther tightened his jaw, his ocular implants scanning the dense foliage. There was nothing. No movement, no thermal signatures beyond the wildlife. It was impossible. His troops were the finest in the galaxy. Their armor was impenetrable. Their weapons unmatched. And yet something unseen was dismantling them piece by piece. A rustling in the distance. A Sith soldier raised his rifle, scanning the undergrowth. His targeting HUD struggled to differentiate movement from vegetation, the sheer volume of plant life overwhelming the system. His grip tightened on the trigger. A whisper of air. The Sith stiffened. A blade protruded from his throat. By the time his squad noticed, he was already gone. Varela crouched low in the brush, wiping the blood from her knife. Nyong'o perched above, nestled within the crook of a tree, his rifle aimed at another unsuspecting alien. He didn't fire. No need to waste a bullet. They weren't here for a fight. They were here to teach a lesson. The jungle was not an obstacle. It was the battlefield itself. It was patient, suffocating, alive with dangers that couldn't be quantified on a HUD display. And for all their technology, for all their firepower, the aliens had forgotten the most fundamental rule of war. The terrain always won. The coalition had come to Earth to prove their dominance. By nightfall they would learn why no army in history had ever conquered the jungle. The jungle had swallowed them whole, and now it had begun to chew. The coalition forces, once confident in their technological superiority, were unraveling. Their formations, so precise in urban environments, had fractured into isolated squads, each one haunted by the unseen menace that stalked them. The trees whispered with movement that never revealed itself, the underbrush rustled with something just beyond reach, and the air itself seemed heavier, thick with the weight of unseen eyes. Commander Relther clenched his jaw as another report came in. 6 more soldiers unaccounted for. No gunfire. No distress signals. Just gone. His elite warriors, the pride of the coalition, reduced to prey. He had fought countless battles on war-torn planets, orchestrated sieges against fortified enemies, torn through opposition with precision and firepower. Yet here, against an enemy he couldn't even see, he was powerless. Thermal scans, he barked, his voice sharp with frustration. Sweep every quadrant. If it moves, burn it. His officers obeyed, activating their equipment, yet the readings were useless. The jungle was too alive, its heat signatures too numerous. Everywhere they turned, the environment drowned them in false positives. Animals, shifting foliage, even the radiating heat of their own panicked forces. The sensors, so reliable in artificial war zones, were overwhelmed by something as basic as nature itself. Varela watched from the shadows, hidden in the thick canopy above, her body blending into the darkness. The aliens below were floundering, their rigid doctrines failing them. Their movements had become erratic. No longer an advancing army but scattered units, their cohesion shattered by fear. Nyong'o crouched beside her, the faintest smirk playing at his lips. They're breaking. She nodded, eyes locked on the nearest squad. 5 Sith soldiers, bulky in their armor, moving too slow, their backs to one another. Their heads swiveled constantly, searching, expecting an attack from anywhere and nowhere. Good. She lifted a small device from her belt and activated it. A sharp whistle cut through the air. Not a natural sound but something close. Something that blended into the jungle's symphony just enough to be unsettling. Across the battlefield, more whistles echoed, human operatives scattered in the trees, their signals seemingly bouncing from every direction. The Sith snapped into a defensive stance, weapons raised. A branch shifted above them. One fired blindly into the treetops. Plasma bolts seared through the leaves, burning holes in the canopy but striking nothing. The jungle swallowed the sound. The humans struck. A sharpened vine looped around the neck of one soldier and yanked him upward. He barely had time to choke before he vanished into the foliage, a strangled gurgle the only sound he made. The other spun in horror, weapons flaring. Another vanished. Then another. By the time the last 2 turned to run, it was already too late. Varela dropped from above, landing silently behind the last Sith. Her knife found the gap between his armor plates, slicing cleanly through. He staggered forward, hands grasping at the wound, but she was already gone, melting back into the darkness. The final soldier stood frozen, chest heaving, rifle trembling in his grasp. He turned in frantic circles, scanning, searching, his breaths ragged. The jungle loomed around him, vast and indifferent. His squad was gone. He was alone. He bolted. Nyong'o let him go. They always let one go. Let the fear spread. Elsewhere the pattern repeated. The coalition's best were being unraveled, one squad at a time. Not through brute force, not through direct engagement, but through something far worse. Attrition of the mind. The jungle was alive, it was hungry, and to the aliens, it was incomprehensible. At one of the remaining coalition encampments, soldiers sat huddled, their usual discipline cracking. The trees beyond their lights were endless, filled with the ghosts of comrades they could no longer reach. A Hekari officer slammed his fists against the tactical display. "We should be winning," he snarled. "We outgun them. We outnumber them. We." A scream cut him off. Short. Guttural. Then nothing. A sentry, only meters from the camp's perimeter, was gone. Weapons snapped toward the darkness, trembling hands gripping triggers. Second scream. Third. Then silence. No movement. No enemy to fire at. Just the empty jungle waiting. Commander Relther watched the terror grip his soldiers, the discipline fading from their eyes. He had commanded legions, had brought entire worlds to heel, but none of that experience mattered here. Here he was no longer in control. For the first time in his career he understood what it meant to be hunted. A rustle behind him. He spun, weapon raised, but it was just the wind through the leaves. Wasn't it? His grip tightened, sweat beading beneath his armor. His orders were drowned beneath the growing certainty that nothing they did would change what was coming. The jungle had decided. And the jungle always won. Dawn broke over the jungle, but it brought no relief. The coalition forces, once so confident in their overwhelming superiority, were now a shattered remnant of what they had been. Their ranks had been thinned, their supplies abandoned in their frantic retreat, and their spirits crushed beneath an enemy they had never truly seen. Commander Relther stood in what remained of the primary encampment, his face drawn and gaunt, his uniform stained with mud and sweat. The jungle had stripped them down to their most basic instincts: survival, paranoia, fear. The last 24 hours had undone centuries of military doctrine, revealing its fatal flaw. It had never accounted for something it could not control. The humans had never once engaged them in a fair fight. That was the lesson. Varela crouched in the branches above, watching the camp with quiet amusement. The alien forces had abandoned even the pretense of discipline. They huddled in defensive circles, weapons aimed at the trees as if the jungle itself were their enemy. Some trembled, eyes hollow with exhaustion. Others whispered among themselves, voices tight with disbelief. "Look at them," Nyong'o murmured beside her. "They're already defeated." Varela nodded. "They just don't know it yet." A flicker of movement in the distance caught her attention. More humans emerging unseen from the foliage, positioning themselves around the camp like shadows slipping through the mist. They could finish this now, strike while the aliens were weak. But there was no need. The jungle had already done the work for them. Relther's comm device crackled. He snatched it up, his fingers trembling. "This is Commander Relther. Report." A broken, static-laced voice answered. "Sir, we can't." A pause. A sharp inhale. "It's everywhere. We move and they..." The line cut. Relther's eyes darted wildly around the perimeter. He could feel them watching. The humans. The jungle itself. He had no choice. Swallowing his pride, he activated the general broadcast. "This is Commander Relther of the Galactic Coalition," he said, his voice tight, forced. "We acknowledge the superiority of your forces in this environment." The words tasted like ash. "We request immediate extraction." A long silence. Then finally, "Understood," a calm voice replied. "Stand by." Relther exhaled shakily and turned to what remained of his troops. They looked to him for reassurance, for orders, for some way to make sense of the nightmare they had lived through. He had none to give. Above, Varela smirked. They had never needed to fire a single shot. The coalition dropships arrived in the early afternoon, their engines roaring as they descended through the dense canopy. The once pristine military vessels, symbols of galactic authority, now looked like lifeboats arriving too late for a sinking ship. The surviving soldiers staggered toward them, their polished armor dulled by mud and sweat, their once proud formations reduced to straggling, hollow-eyed remnants. Commander Relther watched as his troops limped aboard, his fingers tightening into fists. This was not an extraction. This was an evacuation. The humans hadn't just beaten them, they had humiliated them. Not with superior weapons, not with overwhelming numbers, but with something far worse. A battlefield that didn't obey their rules. A rustling in the trees. His head snapped toward the jungle, heart pounding before his mind caught up. Nothing. Just the wind moving through the undergrowth. Just his own paranoia sharpened to a razor's edge. And yet he knew they were still there. Watching. Varela sat perched on a thick branch, hidden within the emerald shadows of the jungle. She saw the last of the coalition soldiers stumble onto the drop ships, their movements stiff as if they were afraid that even the ground beneath them might betray them. She couldn't blame them. They'd spent a lifetime believing the battlefield was something to be conquered. Now they understood. Some places didn't belong to armies. Some places belonged to the ghosts within them. Nyong'o crouched beside her, gaze sharp as he studied the departing vessels. Think they'll be back? Varela considered it. The coalition had waged wars across 1,000 worlds, had crushed species beneath their boots, had bent planets to their will. But they had never faced anything like this. They had never faced the quiet, patient violence of a jungle that had learned, over millions of years, how to kill anything that did not belong. She smirked. No, she said. They learned their lesson. The drop ships vanished into the sky, and the jungle swallowed the silence once more. The jungle exhaled. For the first time in days the air was still. No footfalls of alien soldiers, no clumsy movement breaking the undergrowth, no artificial light staining the deep green shadows. The coalition had left nothing behind but the faint acrid scent of scorched foliage where their weapons had fired blindly into the dark. Varela let out a slow breath, the tension in her muscles easing as she shifted from her perch in the canopy. The battle, if it could even be called that, was over. No victory parades, no grand speeches, just the quiet knowledge that the jungle had defended itself once more. That they had defended it. Nyong'o adjusted his gear beside her, stretching his shoulders as he looked toward the empty sky where the last dropships had disappeared. Think they'll spin this as a tactical retreat? Varela snorted. They can call it whatever helps them sleep at night. He chuckled. Not sure they'll be getting much sleep after this. She nodded, knowing he was right. The fear they had instilled in the coalition soldiers wouldn't fade overnight. It would fester, taking root in every debriefing, in every whispered conversation between troops who had seen what the jungle could do. The lesson would spread through their ranks like an infection. Humans weren't the ones who should fear the wild places. They were the wild places. She pulled her knife from its sheath, running a finger along the flat of the blade, feeling the familiar weight of it. We'll keep watch, she said, glancing at Nyong'o. Just in case someone gets stupid and decides to come back. He grinned. And if they do? Varela smirked, sliding the blade back into place. Then the jungle will teach them again. The distant call of a bird echoed through the trees, its song unbroken by war. The jungle had endured. And it always would. The jungle was never silent, but now its sounds had shifted. No longer disturbed by the heavy boots of invaders, it hummed with the rhythms of life. Branches creaking in the wind, unseen creatures rustling through the undergrowth, the distant chitter of insects and birds reclaiming what had always belonged to them. The balance had returned. Varela moved through the foliage with practiced ease, her steps careful, deliberate. Though the battle had ended, she knew better than to let her guard down. The jungle did not tolerate complacency. It was alive, a force older and wiser than any soldier who dared set foot within its depths. That was why the coalition had lost. They had tried to command something that would never bow to them. She reached the clearing where the last of the coalition's forward operating bases had once stood. Now only the burned-out husks of equipment remained, half swallowed by vines already beginning to reclaim the metal. No bodies. The jungle had taken care of that in its own way. Nyong'o knelt beside a shattered helmet, turning it over in his hands. Think they'll ever tell their people the truth? He asked. Varela leaned against a nearby tree, arms crossed. Of course not. They'll make up some excuse, blame it on bad intel, a miscalculation. Anything but the reality. Nyong'o smirked. That they got their asses handed to them by a bunch of humans in the trees? She chuckled. Something like that. The coalition had seen war in the void, had conquered cities of steel and glass, had flattened civilizations with orbital bombardments. But here, in a place without straight lines, without predictable battlefields, their strategies had unraveled. They had believed the jungle was an obstacle to overcome, failing to realize it was the true enemy all along. A distant howl echoed through the trees, long and low. Not human. Not alien. Just another voice of the wilderness, untouched by war. "Come on," Varela said, pushing off the tree. "Let's check the northern ridge. Make sure no one was dumb enough to get left behind." Nyong'o rose, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "And if they were?" Varela's lips curled into a smirk. "Then they get one chance to run." She glanced at the tangled expanse ahead, the endless green stretching in every direction. "After that, the jungle decides." The two of them vanished into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but the whisper of leaves settling in their wake. The rain had come suddenly, a thick, heavy downpour that drummed against the jungle canopy, sending rivulets of water cascading down in shimmering streams. It smelled of earth and life, of the ceaseless cycle that neither war nor technology could interrupt. It washed away the last traces of the coalition's presence, erasing their footprints, burying their failures beneath layers of mud and leaves. The jungle as always would forget them. Varela crouched beneath the wide leaves of a kapok tree, watching as the water carved tiny rivers through the undergrowth. Rain had never been an inconvenience to her, not the way it was for outsiders. To her it was a reminder of patience, of inevitability. The jungle never rushed. It simply endured. And in the end, everything else yielded to it. Nyong'o was a few meters away, silent as he surveyed the landscape ahead. Even now, long after the battle had ended, they kept moving. That was the nature of their war. It wasn't about occupation or victory parades. It was about ensuring that no one ever dared return. He raised a hand, signaling her to join him. She moved without hesitation, weaving through the trees, stepping lightly over the tangled roots. He was standing at the edge of a ravine looking down. She followed his gaze. Far below, at the base of the rocky cliffside, lay a wrecked coalition dropship. Smoke curled weakly from its broken hull, its impact cratered deep into the soft jungle floor. It hadn't burned. The rain had put out whatever fire had started. But that didn't mean it had no survivors. Varela's grip on her knife tightened. "They must have gone down before extraction," Nyong'o murmured. "Think anyone's still alive?" She studied the wreckage, noting the torn metal, the shattered cockpit. If there were survivors, they weren't in good shape. But more importantly, they were stranded. No reinforcements. No way to call for help. "Maybe," she said. "Not for long." Nyong'o nodded. "We should check." She smirked. "We will." They moved carefully down the slope, keeping to the shadows. The jungle was still watching, waiting, deciding what it would do with these last, lost remnants of an invading army. Varela had no doubt what its judgment would be. She would simply carry it out. The jungle loomed over the wreckage, vines already creeping along the twisted metal, as if nature itself had sensed weakness and moved to reclaim what rightfully belonged to it. The dropship's hull was split down the middle, its sleek exterior now a crumpled ruin of alien alloy. Smoke curled lazily from the wreck, mixing with the mist rising from the damp earth. It was quiet. Too quiet. Varela crouched behind a thick tangle of roots, scanning the wreckage through narrowed eyes. If there were survivors, they were either unconscious or smart enough to stay silent. She wasn't counting on the latter. Nyong'o crept up beside her, his rifle held low but ready. "No movement," he murmured. She nodded. "Could be waiting for rescue." He huffed a quiet laugh. "They're waiting for a ghost, then. No one's coming for them." They both knew it was true. The coalition had cut their losses the moment they lifted off. A single down dropship was nothing to them, just another unfortunate casualty in a campaign they would rather forget. These soldiers weren't a priority. They were loose ends. Varela motioned forward and they moved in, slow and deliberate. The jungle concealed their approach, dampening their footsteps, turning them into shadows among the trees. As they neared the wreck, the scent of burnt metal and scorched fabric grew stronger, mingling with the ever-present humidity of the jungle. A faint sound. A groan. Varela stilled, motioning for Nyong'o to hold position. She tilted her head, listening. Another groan, this one more pained, coming from inside the wreckage. Someone was alive. She stepped forward, knife in hand, and peered through a jagged tear in the hull. Inside, a coalition officer slumped against the wreckage, his leg pinned beneath a collapsed support beam. His uniform was torn, his helmet missing, his pale gray skin smeared with blood. His breathing was labored, his face tight with barely contained pain. His eyes flickered open and for a moment confusion clouded his gaze. Then recognition. Then fear. You. His voice was hoarse. You're human. Varela tilted her head, considering him. And you're in my jungle. The officer swallowed hard, his body tensing. He knew, just as she did, that no reinforcements were coming. That he was at her mercy. Nyong'o stepped inside, scanning the wreckage for weapons, survivors, anything of value. Finding nothing of concern, he leaned against the ruined bulkhead, watching. The officer's breathing quickened. I can offer you something, he stammered. Information. Coordinates. Supply routes. Varela crouched in front of him, resting her knife against her knee. You think we don't already know everything we need to? His mouth opened then closed. His desperation was palpable. He wasn't a soldier anymore. Just another invader who had learned too late that this world did not belong to him. She stood, stepping back into the doorway. The jungle whispered around them, the rain dripping steadily through the canopy. She looked at Nyong'o. The jungle decides. Nyong'o nodded, turning away. The officer's breathing hitched. Wait. His voice cracked, raw with panic. You can't just. But Varela was already walking away, fading into the trees. The jungle would handle the rest. It always did.